is now recording. Okay, so we're going to start the semester with a couple of large conceptual issues. This being the first of them, the next one is next week. Fairly dense, but from our point of view, these are things that people who do communication about the environment or climate change or sustainability struggle with continuously. They're important to understand, ergo the lectures. So the first lecture here is the rationalist and ethical paradoxes, or don't be the ugly American. And I'll explain the joke about being the ugly American or not as I go along. I had you read a piece by Julia Shulevitz from the New Republic. And in that piece, she asks this question. Why do people persist in underestimating risk in the face of clear scientific consensus? I give you a picture of a cigarette box because that's the classic one. We all know you shouldn't be smoking cigarettes because they're bad for you, and we do it anyway. Or some collection of people do it anyway. We're now a smoke-free campus, and a number of my doctoral students, as I walk out the back door of my building, they're all out there literally hiding in the bushes, smoking cigarettes. Okay, that's sort of what this lecture is about. So you read an essay, This is How You Talk to a Climate Change Denier. And it's an introduction, it was in the New Republic of all things, it's an introduction to what I call the rationalist paradox. I'm not making this up, people in environmental communication have used this term. And roughly it refers to people to whom you have given the facts, who know what the facts of the situation are, and continue to act as if they didn't know the facts, continue to do wrong, destructive, inappropriate, take your pick, things, despite the fact that they know better, like, this. And I get to be snotty about this because I was a high school athlete, so I never picked up the habit. If my high school wrestling coach caught me smoking, he would have broken my neck. So, I can be sanctimonious because I never had to have it. Shulevitz, her next question, she asks, she's talking about the problem with things like climate change. Clearly, am I hitting you?
Oh no, I'm just putting yes, and so I'm going to put the brakes on. Yes.
Clearly, scientists can't manage, she says, public reactions to risk as well as they can. History has made fools of environmentalists who believe that people would change their behavior if they only knew how bad global warming could be. This is what Philip Eubanks, from the book The Troubled Rhetoric of Climate Change, he's a rhetoric professor at Illinois State. This is what he means when he says, question, how can reasonable people view the same evidence and make such different judgments? This is the place to begin if you want to communicate successfully about anything environmental or sustainability, something like climate change. So Shulevitz then asks what for me is a very useful question. Okay.
That is. Hang on.
It's back.
Try it again.
It's back.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Let's see if it moves forward one as it's supposed to.
There we go. That was odd.
Okay. The tech guy who was in here for 45 minutes last time and couldn't get it working, the other tech guys came the next day and they said, no, it took us 60 seconds, it was working fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, that tech guy's horrible. He came into our other class and ringed out Professor Herndl and said that he remembers like 4 years ago when he called for the same issue and it's your fault. And he didn't do anything, all he did was push buttons and it just magically came up. It was like a 5-minute rant.
Wow.
Yeah.
I feel like we got a
easy.
I hope my colleague Dave told him where to put it.
No, it was very awkward. It was like we were all kind of like at first we thought he was joking until we realized that he really wasn't, and then everyone was just kind of.
That's not good for his long-term career advancement.
No. It was funny after the fact, but at the time,
Yeah, it wasn't funny at the time.
It was really awkward at the time.
I like being laughed at, but not when they do something really stupid. Okay, so this is Shulevitz. So she's trying to talk about climate denialists. And she says, these skeptics, these denialists, and it's about a third of the people in this country, she says, are they acting in bad faith? Do they just think badly? Are they cynical, ill-educated, innumerate, distrustful of science, pawns of the merchants of doubt? And I'm going to unpack this sentence. If you've read the lecture, I'm going to unpack this sentence for about 8 pages. So she's trying to explain the rationalist paradox. Where does it come from? So in this lecture, I'm going to do a few things. I will explain to you what the rationalist paradox is, and what it means, how to interpret it, how to think about it. Towards the end of the lecture, I'll talk about what I call the ethical paradox as an analogy or a parallel to it. And I should be frank at the beginning. The problem I'm talking about today is a really complex rhetorical problem, and there is not a solution to it. There are, as you will see in the second half of the lecture and in half of the readings, there are ways of addressing it, there are ways of dealing with it, but it doesn't have a solution. It would be dishonest of me to say I can fix this for you. I mean, if we did, everybody would believe the IPCC, our governor would believe in climate change and sea level rise, and we wouldn't have any of these problems. We wouldn't have had how many international conferences about climate change that failed. So what I can give you is an explanation of the problem, how to think about it, some language, some concepts for thinking about it, and in the second half of the lecture, after the intermission and the popcorn break, some strategies, communication strategies for how to deal with it, what to do about it. Let's see.
Carl, do you want to remind them that they can practice?
Oh, yes, thank you. I will remind you, as my colleague is reminding me, at any point, if you have a question or a comment or a little light bulb goes off, open your mouth, talk, say something, ask me a question. Like we started the course last time, consciously with something where you all had to talk and we could loosen up a little bit. Instead of asking you, if you were born again, what kind of animal would you like to be as the icebreaker, we did a kind of syntax thing and grammar thing as an icebreaker, but I want you talking to me. So you've read a lot of complicated stuff. I'm hoping that you have questions and things to say, including what the heck does this mean at any point. Just, start waving an appendage at me and make some noise and interrupt me. Otherwise, it's going to be a long talking head thing. The lecture, and you're not going to get me off track. The lecture is there. You can read it if you want, and we'll post the PowerPoints. So the strategies I'm going to talk about are better than in the Meyer piece. John Meyer says the problem with engaging the everyday and with environmental rhetoric is some people have this easy optimism. We'll come up with technological solutions. Don't worry about it. We'll invent something to solve that problem. Or the pessimism of, doesn't matter what we do, we're all going to hell in a handbasket. We might as well, drive our Hummer, throw the garbage out the back, and burn coal because the world is coming to an end and there's nothing we can do and people are just stupid. Half of it. Anyway, so the things I'm talking about I like to avoid either extreme. Optimism, we're not going to invent our way out of this with new technology only. And the problems are complicated, but there are things we can do. What we say and how we write matters. I wouldn't be doing this otherwise, if I thought otherwise. So, I want to start with what's called the deficit model. Does anybody know what the deficit model is, what it refers to? Okay, in Shulevit's opening, she says, what if people are ill-educated and innumerate? They don't know numbers, they can't deal with math. Sometime in the 80s, in a field called Public Understanding of Science, which has the terrible acronym PUS. Hi, I work in PUS, I work in PUS. Public Understanding of Science, they came up with this thing that they called the deficit model. And they thought the problem with people in America, and the reason we have science controversies like the one over vaccines and autism, or AIDS, or there's a controversy, the controversy about the Aedes aegypti mosquito down in the Keys right now? I'm actually finishing an article on this. A lot of people are upset because they're going to release a genetically modified mosquito to stop the spread of dengue and chikungunya. And the deficit model and a lot of science says, look, just give them information, just educate them. They don't agree with you because they don't know what you know. When they know what you know, they'll agree with you. That's the deficit model. It's based on the assumption that people will act appropriately when they have the right information. It's based on the assumption that people are, like Mr. Spock in Star Trek, purely rational animals. Newsflash, we're not. Philip Eubanks, in his book, The Rhetorician, says that the deficit model really makes what he calls the Enlightenment, the great age of reason, the Enlightenment-inspired error of believing that if you present credible facts in a logical way, audiences will be counted on, can be counted on to draw the right conclusions. It assumes that we are purely rational animals, that we're not, in fact, acting as social actors immersed in partisan, political, social identity contests. There is ample evidence, of course, that people don't behave rationally. And Eubanks, in the piece you read, where he says reasoning backward to forward, gives you an argument for this, which we will get to a little later, where he talks about argumentative reasoning. So instead of being purely rational, most of the time, instead of being the judge, his metaphor was, instead of being a judge in a court where you're sitting there completely disinterested, thinking about case law, everybody is making their case, and you are the epitome of reason, and you adjudicate things in a perfectly fair, rational way. So most of us argue like lawyers. We have a position to defend. So if I'm talking to my next door neighbor, Claude, who doesn't believe in climate change, I've already got a position. I know what I believe. I know I'm right, and I'm going to argue like a lawyer. I'm going to push my case, not be purely rational. And if you read the Myers piece, one of the things he says, much like Cahane's cognitive or cultural cognition, we'll talk about this, is that when you do that, as you read information, you're really just picking out the pieces that support your position and throwing away the pieces that don't support your position. You are reading, it's what Myers calls confirmation bias. As you read things, you're looking for things that confirm your pre-made position. You're not being purely rational, you're being very selective. Yes?
Are you talking about humans in general, or how you should argue?
Both. The difference here is how you should argue and how you do argue. There's a long tradition in rhetoric and in logic about how we should argue. And sometime around the 1950s, there were a whole group of people, Oxford ordinary language philosophers like J.L. Austin, John Searle, people in rhetoric like Obrecht Stopeka, who said how we should argue and how we do argue are two very different things, theory and practice. And Cahane's work, Eubanks' work, is not saying this is how we ought in some ideal world to argue. This is how people actually argue. So last class I talked about how people process information, how your brain works. Eubanks' whole argument, or his whole thesis is, instead of classical reason, the judge who is purely logical, most of us are social players. We have a tribe, we have a community, and we have deep set values. And we come to most of these questions, and I'll pick this up a little later, but we come to most of these questions already predisposed to have a particular position. And when we argue about it, we tend to argue as a partisan, and we tend to argue based on what we value, how we feel, who we want to be identified with, rather than pure facts. So, in a sense, how we should argue and how we do argue are different. And then, if I really want to be sneaky, how we do argue is how we, as communicators, should then use that. Don't talk to people as if they were purely rational. The thesis that Myers gets to and that Eubanks gets to is that the problem with the deficit model is it leads you to believe that, look, if you don't agree with me, I just got to keep giving you facts. And I will keep showing you how smart I am and how many facts I have. And sooner or later, you're either dishonest or stupid, or you will believe me. I'm sorry, if I'm jumping in. And that doesn't work. The problem with the deficit model is it alienates people. It causes trouble.
Can I add something to that, Carl?
Yeah.
Which is that, so Carl, at some point in what you were just saying, you said that it's, we bring all these values and bias and pre-existing social connections, and we want to develop a certain persona for ourselves to the conversation. It's not just about facts. And I think for a lot of us, particularly people who are already kind of scientifically minded or inclined, the answer would seem to be, well, we should get everyone to just pay attention to the facts, right? Like, you should just find a way to cut through the bias and cut through the value. But one of the several problems with that answer is that even what constitutes a fact is already itself biased, right? So you can, climate change is a perfect example. Climate change facts, right? The fact of climate, I don't need to do that because I'm a climate change skeptic. Like, the idea that climate change is happening is predicated on scientific modeling, primarily, currently. And a lot of people don't think that modeling yields facts as a technique, as a scientific technique. So even the question of what a fact is and how we arrive at facts is itself already a question that is influenced by bias and value. So it's not like we can just clear away the clutter and get to some truth that is fundamentally out there. There are certain things that we've already agreed upon, and one of the pieces talks about this idea that certain things are uncontroversial, right? And that's, at some point we all decided that our values and biases all aligned. It's not that the facts themselves were always that obvious necessarily.
Yeah.
That's all.
You're not hearing us say there aren't facts.
No,
you're not
no,
hearing
no,
us
no.
say we don't believe there's a science of climate change. And you're not hearing us, if you're hearing that, that's not what we're trying to say.
No.
We've both just been reading a great big book about modeling and modeling science and how models are made and information infrastructure and very detailed arguments about where data comes from and how data, especially globalized data, gets made through models. And lots of people distrust models. What we're driving at here, and this is in the lecture, I don't know if you've heard of him, there's a guy named Mike Hume, wrote a book called Why We Disagree About Climate Change, Controversy, Disagreement, Opportunity. Hume has a degree in physics. He was the director of the Tyndall Center for Climate Change at East Anglia University. And in this book he says, look, the fact of the matter is there are a lot of reasons why people disagree about climate change that are actually reasonable disagreements. It's not just that they are stupid, innumerate, cynical, what have you. I can think of politicians who I think will disagree with climate change and deny it for purely cynical, self-interested reasons. But Tyndall, who spent a decade running a climate science center, says, you know, our work is whole staff. In fact, people disagree for lots of reasons, not all of them irrational. And that's sort of the position we're talking about. And for people like us, and I assume you guys, who are really committed to science and modeling and spend a lot of time around climate scientists, it drives me batty when people don't get the science. I thought about getting a great big sticker of the, you know, the Keeling curve of CO2 on Mount Mauna Loa. You know, every 55 years of CO2 measurements on Mount Mauna Loa, and it's just going up and up and up and up and up and up. You know, I thought of having that made in a transparent thing and putting it on the rear window of my Subaru, and just, you know, nothing else, just driving around with that, as if that was going to change anybody's mind. You know, because it just drives me nuts. I look at it and I think, there it is. You know, one picture, I understand climate change. How could you disagree with that? And in a sense, it's frustrating, but there are lots of reasons people can disagree with that and not be persuaded, which is what this lecture is about. And how you should argue and how you would be more strategic to argue emerges from that issue. So let's see, where am I? The problem is, and I'll get to my joke about the ugly American now instead of later. Some years ago, my wife and I were in a small village in Spain, and it was cold and wet, so we were actually eating in a hotel, which we almost never do. And the hotel was full of older British and American couples, and I was the only customer speaking Spanish to the staff. And the man at the table next to me, you know the joke about the ugly American, you go to a foreign country where they speak a different language, and if they don't understand you, you just say it louder and slower and louder and slower, because sooner or later they'll get. The man next to me was trying to charge his dinner to his room, and he turns to the wait staff and says, "Unos, dos, 8. Unos, dos, 8. You know, and he keeps this up, and the woman's looking at him, and finally, you know, I kind of leaned over and said, 128. You know, told her in Spanish. Got it. You know, she writes it down, no problem. And he's the ugly American. The deficit model is those of us who do sustainability or environmental communications to yell unos, dos, 8 all the time at people. here's some more data. Let me explain what this Keeling curve really means. Oh, you want to read all of the IPCC report? What you need to hear is unos, dos, eight. It doesn't work. It pisses people off. Can I say this on film? The same restaurant.
Go for it.
The same restaurant. My wife was sick to her stomach. She had a little flu from traveling. And I ordered her a bowl of the local soup, sopa típico. And she didn't, or I ordered a great big meal and I'm chowing down. She had 2 or 3 spoonfuls of it. People in here speak Spanish? Okay, you'll get the joke if I say it right. And the waitress came over with my wife and said, "Pobrecita, ¿tú no gusta? ¿Tú no gusta la sopa?" Poor dear, you don't like the soup? And my wife doesn't like to make a fool of herself in public. She has some real dignity. I don't have any dignity, and I make a fool of myself. So I'm talking away in Spanish, and I said, "Ella no tiene hambre." No, ella no tiene hambre. In Spanish, like French, to say she's not hungry, you say she has no hunger. The word for hunger is hombre. The word for man is hombre. And I said, "Ella no tiene hombre." And the waitress looks at my wife, pats her on the hand and says, "Pobrecita." She looks at me and says, "Comprendo, pobrecita." So I got to be the ugly American anyway. It was sort of embarrassing. Okay, end of joke. So, deficit model. This is what, where am I? This is what Myers says about this. To be sure, both science and morality must be deeply informed with the quest for sustainability. Yet no matter how sound the science, nor how widely shared the moral propositions, they can't resolve differences in how to act or in the distribution of consequences of a given act. The urgent demand to act cannot erase, and it should not hide the inescapable political judgments that shape what action is deemed fitting, feasible, or fair in a given context. To confuse scientific expertise and moral conviction with the political judgment, which is a completely different thing. Not what is and exists, but what should we then do? To confuse those two, he says, can often lead to perceiving resistance or inaction as objectively ignorant, deficit model, apathetic, or immoral egoism. This perception in turn contributes to the view held by many that environmentalists are arrogant or elite. He's not saying science doesn't matter. He's not saying facts aren't important. He's not saying we don't know these things. What he's saying is that judgments about what we ought to do and how different people come to those political judgments aren't purely factual. And if we think they are and yell unos, dos, eight, enough, what we're going to do is piss people off. It's counterproductive. It's the problem with the deficit model. And in case you think this is just the English professor saying this, I was talking to a grant administrator at the NSF, and he said, "Oh yeah, here at the NSF, we agreed that the deficit model was a bad idea about 10 years ago. Anybody who does that is just wrong." So it's not the English professor. The National Science Foundation will tell you the same thing. I'm not just making this up. Okay, where am I? I start here because the deficit model and the assumption that we're just going to give them the facts is pretty much what most people coming into a program in sustainability, like you, like me, who are really committed to these things, it's the position you start with. "Oh, I'm going to learn all this really cool stuff, and I'll just tell them the facts. Man, I'm going to change the world." And frustrating as all get out, but as a rhetorician, my first job is to say, that is an interesting theory that doesn't work, and let's think about now why it doesn't work. Where am I? Okay, so Myers talks about what he calls the outside critic. That is the person who is perceived by everybody in the community to be an elitist, to be special. The guy who has the PhD, who comes in to my next door neighbor and says, "Claude, just sit down, have a beer, Claude, and listen to me. I can explain it to you and why you're wrong, because I know better than you do. And I'll explain this to you, Claude." And that almost never works. That position assumes, as Cagle says, a kind of dichotomy between those who know and the many who don't. or those who see clearly, and the many who are myopic. And when we talk to people that way, they figure out that this is what we think, that I'm smart and you're not, that I'm enlightened and you're not. And it may be that in fact, we all do know a lot of facts that they don't know. But A, they might disagree for other reasons, and B, it's never really good to say, look, you disagree with me because you're stupid and ignorant. That's not, I mean, that's what you're saying, what you're doing and saying, and that doesn't work. So, I want to talk about some of the problems we face. In a sense, I should have titled this, damned if you do, damned if you don't. You're damned rhetorically if you say, Joshua, listen to the facts. When I'm done talking, you will agree with me because I'm smarter than you are. And you don't say that, but unos dos eight gets the point across. It's not going to work. It's going to alienate. On the other hand, if you don't communicate those facts, you don't try, well, you're damned to lose anyway. It's an interesting catch-22 that we have to navigate, which is what this lecture is about. So, come on. The first piece of it, Shulevitz talks about the pawns of the merchants of doubt. Does anybody know that book? I took this from The Wizard of Oz, of course. Shulevitz is articulating a thesis that the Union of Concerned Scientists have made 5 or 6 years ago in a book called Smoke, Mirrors, and Hot Air, in which they argue and detail that the people who deny climate change are making functionally the exact same arguments that the people who denied the link between tobacco and cancer are making, that the arguments are structurally the same. It's a rearguard action to protect an industry. It's smoke, mirrors, and hot air. My colleague Marlia Banning published a piece where she spent the first half of it detailing all the work that oil companies, think tanks, their hired rhetoricians, and their hired scientists have done to create what she calls a manufactured controversy. The controversy over climate change, the argument goes, is in fact manufactured by Fox News, the oil industry, and the coal industry, and a handful of scientists, and a handful of marketers and rhetoricians. Yeah?
I mean, it may sound bad, but I feel like, in all honesty, the 1/3 of people in the United States that don't believe that climate change exists will never believe that climate change exists, even if we were in like a Mad Max society and the oceans were gone, that those people that would still hold on to the fact that while there's coal in the ground, why don't we dig it up and burn it?
Well, I think you're right and maybe wrong. I think there is a certain percentage of people who, no matter what you say, the rational enlightenment position is that, if you talk long enough and you deliberate, you can bring people to enlightenment. And everything you've read for tonight, I will admit, there are people that you're right, they're never going to change their mind. They can't. As you will see late in the lecture, they have to change who they are. Yeah. It's not just their economic interest. It's their social identity. It's their personal identity. It's their family. I'm a 4th generation coal miner. I'm in Appalachia. And blah blah blah. The person would have to discount the family history and who he is. He's not going to change his mind.
I grew up in that area, in the little tri-state area between Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. And my grandfather worked in the coal mines and the steel industry. And I know the thought process is that that's all you know how to do is to mine coal. So you don't think, after you've been mining coal for 20 years, you're going to die from black lung anyway. There's really no time. So I feel like, unfortunately, there's a swath of the United States that, one, it's useless because nothing comes out of those areas anyway. And the only thing we really get out of those areas are the opposite rhetoric of, I love Jesus, the United States is great, let's go fight wars with everybody, and no such thing as climate change.
I'm going to leap forward a whole bunch of slides. Oh, no, stop. 2 slides. You're right and wrong. I think there is a swatch, some percentage, I don't know how big it is, 5%, 15%, what's Donald Trump's rating in the polls? Of people who will never change their minds.
Yeah.
And when I was in high school, I used to think, well, we can convince them. And I realized there are people who did, frankly, don't waste your time. Don't waste your breath.
Yeah.
It's like being in AA. Mr. Rhetorician, Lord, give me the wisdom to fight the battles I can fight and give up on the ones I can't. The problem is there's a great big huge swath of people in the middle. They're not us in this room, and they're not the ones at the Coal Miners Association. Think of one of the examples I was thinking of when I was writing this lecture or reviewing it. Anybody familiar with what's going on in Burns, Oregon? It is Burns, isn't it? Not
Is
Ben?
it
Yeah, it's Burns, Oregon, where the
wildlife refuge?
wildlife refuge in Oregon, where the Bundys have taken over the wildlife refuge. Huh?
Yeah, and his dad or brother was the other.
There's a family from Wyoming, I think, the Bundys. I used to live out west, and actually lived literally on the open range. And I'd have the farmers' cattle coming up and scratching themselves on the side of my house and pooping on the front porch. And the law said if you don't want them in your driveway, on your porch, you are required to fence them out because this is the open range and it's the law of the West. But the Bundys have been running their cattle, privately owned cattle, on government land owned by the United States Forest Service, for decades, for free. They refuse to pay any of the fees. And they've been doing things that are really destructive to the ecosystems, to the riparian areas and stuff like that. And there was a big fight, there was a standoff with the federal marshals. So now...
That was 2014.
That was 2014. Now that group of people, they've taken over with armed weapons. They've taken over a federal wildlife refuge in southeastern, I had to figure out where it was, southeastern Oregon in Burns. And they're occupying with assault rifles a federal wildlife refuge. They've torn off the fences. They've taken all the tractors and things and given them to farmers to use to plow their land because this stuff belongs to the people. Doesn't belong to the government. This belongs to the people, and people should be able to use these machines. And, sorry, I'm from rural North Carolina, and I do slip into redneck pretty easily. What you're getting is, and I think you're right, there's a sense in which I'm never going to make any headway with the Bundys. Among other things, they're famous. They're cultural icons. They have a following. They have to they have to change their name from Bundy to Homer Simpson if they gave up what they believe. They'd have to give up what they believe, where they live, who they are, everybody in their community, and nobody's going to give that up. They would literally die first. So I'm not going to argue with them, but the people in Burns are listening, and that mid-swatch, the people in that community can be talked to and listened. They don't like having the Bundys there. Yeah. Some of them say, we appreciate your position. The argument was a couple of local ranchers from Burns had gone out and set fire to the federal range to kill weeds and promote grasses so that they could run their cattle on it. And the federal government said, look, you can't just go out and start setting wildfires on federal land. It's not your land. You don't have a permit. This is a violation. And they arrested them and sent them to jail for some period of time.
5 years.
5 years.
I
mean, I can't go down the road here and set a wildfire in, New Tampa because I want to clear some land. I'm not allowed to do that. But
At the same time, though, I would add to this conversation that it's easy to make a lot of assumptions based on. It's easy to make a lot of assumptions about who you can and can't persuade. And a lot of times I think those assumptions have to do with our own cultural cognition, bias, and value. Like, it's not like we in this room have somehow access to some objective position that those people don't. Like, at some point, and this is the thing that keeps me up at night, to be completely honest, this is my nihilistic 2 a.m. thought, is that at some point we all just have to make a choice. There is no bottom, there is no floor. You just have to decide, this is who I am, this is what I stand for. And you can do that based on facts that you think are out in the world, but if you accept certain things as fact, that means you also accept all the things that come with them. So if I accept climate change as fact, then that means I'm also a person who believes in the scientific method, and I'm also a person who does X and does Y. And at some point, you just have to make a choice and live with it. And so I think it's easy for us to forget that we also have made those choices. And so even when those people like the Bundys are making choices that look very different from mine, that in some ways, I just have to go out on a limb and say, I think my choices are better. And that's what gives me the right to even try and persuade people in the first place. Like, what gives me the right to try and persuade people to change their mind? I just have to decide that I have that right at some point. And that's getting into ethics. But the counterexample I would provide to this idea that there are people who are unpersuadable is there's a very, very well-written story. It's a long journalistic profile of the daughter of the founder, granddaughter of the founder of the Westboro Baptist Church.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you know about the Westboro Baptist Church. It's a super fundamentalist, right-wing Christian church in the U.S.
Or my friend's funeral.
Yeah, they
and had
pick
their
it.
signs about he deserved to die.
Yeah, so they.
Gays in the military. So, yeah.
Well,
They're-
their argument is people in the military died because of America's sins, because we allow homosexuals to live in America. They're wildly homophobic,
Yeah.
and they pick at military funerals because, because you represent this country and defend the Constitution, which defends homosexuals, you deserved to die. They're pretty whacked out.
They're super
Julio.
whacked out.
But I just think that some stuff like that is just shouldn't be allowed to even happen in the first place.
Uh-huh.
It's like when you're partying in Ybor City and there's people like that are religious.
Yes.
I mean, bothering literally.
Well, let me finish real quick what I was saying. The counterexample is that this woman, the granddaughter of the founder, I'm not going to disagree with you. I am. If I had to choose, I'd go with France on free speech rather than U.S., if that means anything to you. But the granddaughter of the founder of the church, she was assigned to run their Twitter account, and then she left the church because of conversations she had on Twitter, right? And that's you want to talk about people you never expected to change their mind. But she left the church. She denounced the church. She is completely living a totally separate life. She walked away from her family. She walked away from her identity. These are people who are homeschooled. These are not people, no, that's not true actually. They sent them to public schools at least for a while so that they could spread their message, right? But she walked away from everything she had been taught to be from the moment she was born because of conversations she had in public spaces with people who thought differently. So if that can happen to her, then I think we have to be very careful about the assumptions we make about who is persuadable and who is not.
Part of what you're hearing is Cagle and I are writing a piece about climate change denialism online and blogs and online forums. And the assumption is that nothing ever happens online except,
People yelling.
people yelling at each other and never changing
Yeah.
their minds. And our argument is that actually, if you look in the right places for the right kinds of reasons, people actually do talk to each other and they do actually ask real questions and they do engage in deliberation and some movement happens. It's not just a place where the ultra right wing says, you're a warmist, and we say you're a denialist. Julio, finish what you interrupted you.
It was kind of like that, and then and sometimes you're there, and then you're thinking, how can, like, you can't literally, if I go in front of a church and I'm parading with a speaker and saying what I think about, like whatever comes to mind, then it will be offensive and I probably will get arrested. But how come the reverse of it, it allows to happen, it seems not to be a problem. So there's a bias.
I know, but it's our system of free speech.
It would work both ways.
No, because I was recommended, because I was in uniform, and they were at my friend's funeral, and I had some very, very choice words for one of them as to where they could go and where they could meet me after the funeral. And then I was reprimanded and told that I'm in uniform and I represent the United States Army, to which I said, that's fine. And as the United States Army, I will meet him where I told him I would meet him. I'm more than happy. I'm pretty sure everyone else here would too. But it's one of those ones where, unfortunately, freedom of speech, you have to recognize that just because they don't agree with your opinion, the freedom is that they have the right to say it.
At the same time, I think you're onto something, Julio, right? And what you're talking about is privilege. Yeah. That freedom of speech is supposed to be, in the U.S., a universal right, granted to everybody. And there's a ton of debate around a lot of issues in the U.S. right now about whether freedom of speech should equal freedom from criticism, right? Like people, it's like, you don't get to say like freedom of speech, and it's like, no, freedom of speech doesn't mean I don't get to tell you you're an asshole. So, for that thing that you said. But I think there are very clear examples of where freedom of speech is not protected equally, and that's often the result of privilege.
When we get later on in this lecture, let me think. In the Kahane and Brahman piece on cultural cognition, they say, after they lay out their theory, about which more very soon, and they say people filter facts to fit the worldview that they come from. And it's not that they don't believe the facts, they don't even see the facts. They don't exist for them. Not that the facts don't exist, but for certain kinds of people, certain kinds of facts, about which more in a minute, simply don't exist. And their response is, the solution to this is what they call careful, pluralistic deliberation. People get together and talk. What you guys are talking about, I'm sorry, go ahead. Interrupt.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm jumping into it, but
Didn't jump into it.
It's not that people don't believe it or just don't understand. I think they just don't want to change.
Oh.
It's not about understanding. You know, I think like most people do understand. They know something's going on or whatever, but they just don't want to change.
Do you mean
It's
on all
why-
issues, Pedro, or
No,
anything
the
in
climate
particular?
change
Climate
issue,
change kind of stuff.
especially.
Yeah.
It's because it's part of like, especially like here in America, like it's a way of life. They're not gonna change. I'm gonna, still drive a big car. I want my house with all the stuff. I
Yeah.
wanna buy tons of stuff every single Halloween or whatever. And when we come, I'm saying because when we are from outside, we come here, we see there's a ton of stuff. There's not gonna change.
Yeah.
So it's not that people don't understand.
The piece you guys read by Myers, no, Eubanks, he
Oh.
talks about what he calls the resonance dilemma.
No, that's fine.
Is that Myers?
Yeah.
Okay. In my funny little world, in rhetoric, we make a distinction between persuading somebody and motivating somebody. The distinction you're just making. What Myers says is sometimes, and it's on one of these slides, but he says sometimes people understand the facts, but it doesn't resonate with them. They don't find it compelling. They're not motivated to change. He says it's not that they don't know. It's just, it would cost them so much, either economically or personally or socially, or just in practical everyday life, to not do that they're just not going to do it. And when we get to the last half of this lecture, part of what this is how do you get things to resonate? Josh.
Going off of what he said, I think it's that people don't really have to deal with the consequences of how they live. Like when I was reading through this stuff, I was thinking, we as a society throw a lot away, and we take that for granted, but if the garbage trucks stop coming to our houses, then we would realize, you can't even pull into your driveway because garbage is.
One of the
Then
things.
people say, "Oh, okay."
One of the things that Myers talks about engaging the everyday. And he says a lot of the reason things either resonate for us or don't resonate for us is that they are attached to and part of not big ideas. And when we get to this piece of the lecture, I'll move through it really fast. He says people don't operate and aren't moved by abstract ideas. Often they are moved by everyday material practices like, did they pick up the bloody garbage? And if you stop picking up the garbage, you realize, look at how much I throw away. Or, I know this sounds really funny, I used to live in a small college town in the Midwest, and I used to take a lot of my yard waste and stuff to the yard waste site at the city dump. But when I went to the city dump, I'd be driving out onto the landfill in my pickup truck, the professor with his pickup. And I saw all this stuff people were throwing away, and it was literally in my face. One of the things that will come up in about 2 or 3 weeks is a lecture on sustainability and making the invisible visible, the stuff you don't see. And when out of sight, out of mind, we don't see the consequences of it. I think you're absolutely right. You gotta,
Yeah, I was gonna say, well, I had another comment, but then what you just said made me think of something else. Like, I'm an intern at Keep Tampa Bay Beautiful, and where I live, there's no recycling program. So if you want to recycle, you gotta drive like 20 miles, and it's just not practical or, financially feasible.
you also burn more carbon driving
Yeah,
20
it
miles
is.
than you
I'll
save
be honest.
recycling.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I have a big truck. It's not
Life cycle analysis.
friendly. But when I started interning there, obviously they recycle, and so I bring all my recycles with me when I go to work. And it made me realize how much you're really throwing out, because I have a big moving box in the back of my truck where I fill it up, and my wife gets it. And I had to get a second one and fill it up, and I was going twice a week to intern, and it made me realize how much. But what I was going to say originally was, I think the problem with climate change and getting people to really let it sink in is that when you tell them that we need to cut carbon and we need to do all this, but you're telling them that what they're doing now is going to affect 2100. So to get people to get on board with something that they're never going to see in their entire life, maybe their grandkids aren't going to see, it's one of those ones that there's no incentive because they don't give a shit. I mean, it's like, okay, let me do what I want. I'll be dead before that happens.
In
This is
3
This is
weeks,
the second part of making the invisible visible.
yes, in 3 weeks, I'll be giving a lecture called Making the Invisible Visible. And part of the thesis of this lecture, and it's in the introduction to the book on sustainability I just wrote, says sustainability is invisible for 3 reasons. It's distant in time, it's distant in space, it's over there in some other country in a different part of the world, and it's invisible because it's mundane. It's so ordinary, accepted, you just don't see
Which
it.
is
Like
Josh's point
throwing
about
away
trash.
garbage.
Yeah.
Yeah, Josh's point about garbage.
Yeah, and it is. I mean, you have, a 2 degrees Celsius, which to most people doesn't mean anything anyway. They're thinking, okay, well, now I don't need to buy a jacket in winter. What do I really care if you live in Florida? No one's thinking, hey, in maybe 20 years, my house is underwater, but maybe they won't be alive at that point. Or if they do, they're like, well, I'll figure it out when I get there.
One of the, I can't remember who wrote this, but one of the cynical comments about this, and then I'll answer one of your questions and get back to the lecture. One of the cynical comments about this is, how do you think we're going to get people to care about sustainability or climate change 100 years from now when we live in a 60-second culture, in a 90-day culture, when all you're worried about is what the stock return is going to be this quarter? I can't remember the exact term for it. It's short-term thinking or 90-day thinking. We live in a culture where nobody plans, more than 2 months in advance.
I mean, how many people even have a retirement fund? Right. I mean, I do too. I get my army money for my.
In case it makes you feel any better, my wife and I have lost $60,000 in the last 2 weeks.
Oh.
Thank you, stock market.
Yes. Amy, I saw you
so-
sort of.
I just was connecting what you were saying, that's 3 different things, like the fear of the unknown, it's an easy thing to turn off, you don't know what's out there, face the fact.
Yeah.
That's risk assessment is kind of what you're talking about. Like that's people, the sustainability communication, the way that we're talking about it, shares a lot of ground with risk communication, which is another big field that's been around for like 30 to 40 years as a standalone subfield. And that's one of the big things they talk about is all of the different psychological factors that go into how we do and don't assess risk. And so if it's uncertain or it doesn't seem to be affecting us immediately, or we just can't even quite grasp it. So this is the difference between the national response to 9/11 versus the national response to climate change, right? Like an immediate present threat and danger is something that we are going to assess at a higher risk, even if sort of scientifically speaking, factually speaking, I myself might not be at as much risk.
If you-
It's a comfort zone thing too.
Yes,
I'm
yeah.
not comfortable here, so I don't know, but I don't understand everything that's working as opposed to, is this that?
The problem with a lot of risk assessment is it works on an algorithm that says the possibility of the event happening multiplied by the severity or the consequences of the event gives you the risk. And that's a mathematical, rational calculation. But lots and lots of people don't think that way. They think, the possibility. So we know 9/11 happened. The consequences were pretty horrible. We're not sure, although there's lots of evidence that climate change is going to happen. And I hope I don't offend anybody. The consequences of climate change are going to make 9/11 look like, Sunday in the park. but you can see the one, and it's emotional, it's about identity, it's about patriotism, it's about America, it's about religious differences, and those things
There's
make,
an enemy.
it's about an enemy, those things make the formula of possibility versus times consequences. Makes that risk assessment, that purely rational risk assessment, largely irrational, or irrelevant for most people. Last thing I wanted to say before I,
Okay.
yes?
Oh, I was gonna point us, I brought us back to where we were.
Okay. Last thing I was going to say, we were talking, you were talking about the Westboro Baptist people and about not being fair and who gets to talk. And Cagle said, partially this is about privilege and access to the media and who gets to talk. And one of the things Cagle says, I'm back to where I was 15 minutes ago. This is why I drink coffee before I teach. I have to remember things. When I get out of here, it's like, can I find my way home? Cagle says the best solution to this problem, about which more in about 10 seconds or 30 seconds, is to have genuinely pluralistic dialogue and deliberation. The problem with that, that model comes from a book called Communicative Rationality, written by the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas. I've got it on a slide somewhere, I think. And in this, Habermas invents what he calls the ideal speech situation. And he says, if you want to have what he calls a communicative ethics, if you want to have an ethical society about how people talk and solve problems, how they communicate ethically, in the ideal speech situation, absolutely everybody gets to talk, gets to participate as equals in an open and public forum. And the feminist philosopher Nancy Fraser, in a book called Unruly Practices, about 8 years later, says, Jürgen, baby, wouldn't it be nice if it were true, but it ain't. Look around the world. Women never have the kind of access, privilege, opportunity to participate in most of these arguments, certainly not as equals, and they don't get heard. Your ideal is only an ideal. And the Habermasian response is, you're right. It's, how do we argue? How should we argue? How should we have an ideal speech situation and have genuinely pluralistic deliberation? But look at what we do when we really try to deliberate. Who gets marginalized? Who doesn't get to talk? Who gets power and access? I've represented myself in court twice, and both times I've won because I'm a practicing wordsmith. And the poor SOB, this was, it went to arbitration, and the poor SOB who was arguing against me, I had a power and privilege with words and did some reading of the law, and he didn't have a chance. My PhD in privilege gave me a kind of access in the legal forum that he didn't have. So, okay. So the solution to the cultural cognition problem, that we should talk together in a genuinely deliberative and plural way in the ideal speech situation, is a good model, the closest we can get to it. Great, but we don't always get there. It's, the question, Julio, that you're talking about, the question you're talking, yeah, can't solve that one, pisses me off. Somewhere in the middle, we have to settle with the law that says, okay, this is acceptable, this isn't, you just crossed a line. Some of us want to move that line one way or another. It's what the Supreme Court does. There is, I'll stop in a second. There's no such thing as a law in this country. The law means what those 9 justices of the Supreme Court mean. And they read the Constitution, and they look at a case, they interpret it, and then they just decide, this is what our law is. And it moves, and it shifts. There is no absolute right and wrong. It shifts, and it shifts decadally between, it used to be in the Warren Court, it was very liberal, and in the court since Ronald Reagan, it's been increasingly conservative, and the laws are changing. Last thing before I get back to where I'm supposed to be.
I think the main thing is that when you were talking before about like Fox News and that, is that there really is no longer a media voice for like the middle ground, for the people who are, they want things to change, but they don't need to be so drastic about it. You have the far left saying, take everyone's guns, we need to stop this, stop that, and the far right saying, I want 1,000 guns, and let's get all the foreigners out of our country. But there's really no longer any kind of media outlet for the sensible people who, use reason and, don't need to be a red state or a blue state. They're just, a human being who wants what's best for everybody.
Yeah. So my response to that is that I get very suspicious anytime someone uses the phrase "there is no longer," because that always puts me on the alert for a romanticization of a past that maybe didn't exist. So my gut response is that we would have to make sure, like, I think that there is polarization of the media landscape. That's just a fact. Like, you can't escape that. Fox News, that kind of really far right-wing party mouthpiece did not exist 50 years ago. But that doesn't mean that the news that was on 50 years ago wasn't also biased in its own way.
Oh yeah, now
Right,
we have McCarthyism and everything else.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that the danger of romanticizing some past that maybe didn't exist is that it prevents us from being critical of the past, and also perhaps sets up an ideal that isn't even possible, right? So if the idea is, well, we want a media channel that's right down the middle for the sensible people who are using reason, we're right back where we started, that, wait a second, who are the sensible people using reason? Everyone's using reason, we're just all coming at it from different directions, and all of our reasoning is starting from different places. So there is no middle neutral ground, right? Do you see what I'm getting at?
No, I would agree in history.
Yeah.
And I'm
Like
sure where you're
now I
coming
think,
from is-
so my ideal situation would be more diversity of
Yeah.
media channels. And more mechanisms to encourage people, and I don't know what that would look like, whether it's political or educational or whatever, but more mechanisms to get people to not limit themselves to particular media channels. That would be my ideal situation. I think we're fooling ourselves if we think we could set up some sort of media channel that is sort of right down the middle.
I don't
way
think
to
there
go.
necessarily is a middle,
Yeah,
but people get into that, they
Yeah.
get sucked into that tank of, they only watch one channel and that's their,
Yeah, and
that's
that's
their worldview. You can tell,
separate issue.
yeah, you can tell in a second that they're.
You're absolutely right in a sense. I'm going to sort of disagree and agree with my colleague.
Okay.
It is clearly true that American politics are more partisan and divided than they have been in the past. The two parties fail to agree on anything, and they don't want to compromise. A lot of that filters down to their kind of core outside wing constituencies. E.J. Dionne, the columnist for the Chicago Tribune, just published a book called, it's just out, called How the Right Went Wrong. And it's an argument about how the right wing in America, starting in the 80s, became functionally attached to talk radio and Fox News, and completely shifted. A couple of fairly famous old Republicans who left the Republican Party said truthfully and sincerely, I didn't leave the party left me. The party took a hard right-hand turn and left me. So there is a sense in which you are right, and Cagle is right. You don't want to romanticize the past.
No.
You know, it used to be better, and now we're all just, whatever, if we could get back to there. There's also a whole series of research by a husband and wife team, the Boykoffs, and they document the rise in the last 20 years or so of the media ethic that says you have to represent both sides of a question. So when you bring in the climate change scientist, you have to bring in, to listen to the other side of the argument, you bring in the denialist. And there's a great comedic riff on Stephen Colbert, where he says, okay, we're going to bring in the 3 guys who don't believe in climate change, and we're going to bring in the other 97 who do. And so you're not wrong. I think, and I'm not going to try to make it up whole tonight, but I think there are outlets, and this is sort of what Cagle and I are working on, a piece we're working on. There are places that actually aren't on either extreme, and where people do sort of listen to each other. I would say to reason, but listen to each other and deliberate, and some change happens. But for a lot of people, they don't want to do that, because it is in fact, as I will say later in this lecture, it threatens who they are, it threatens their identity, and they can't afford to do that.
Like my family and myself have been Republicans since the beginning of our family, and I don't feel like I'm not independent, because I don't feel like either party really
It's represented.
has my best interest in mind. They don't have people interest anymore. Like the thing they have going in California, I would totally vote for that, to where they have to wear the crap as to who sponsors
This
them.
brings us back to what Pedro was saying too, right? About this idea that people understand and they just don't want to change, right? Like, I understand that I should probably do a better job of diversifying my media consumption, but God, it sounds torturous to go off nytimes.com. Like, yeah, so,
Well, I know I should go home and drink a couple of beers tonight. I'd lose that 15 pounds I'd like to lose, but it ain't happening.
all right, where were we?
Back on track.
Yeah, let's give
So-
it 10 more minutes, by the way.
Wow, I'm gonna have to move. Okay. We get to cultural cognition. We've sort of been talking about this. Kahane is from the Yale Law School, Kahane and Brahmanar. They've done a lot of their work in South Florida. They invented this term, cultural cognition. As you'll see shortly, I don't think they invented the concept, they invented the term. But their question is this one, how do people, particularly ordinary citizens who lack not only experience with the myriad of hazards, but also the time and expertise necessary to make sense of complex technical data, how do ordinary people form positions on the dangers they face and what they should do about them? Not how do experts, how do purely rational, but how do ordinary people actually do this? This is where they start. And their answer, essentially, is back to this chart we were looking at a minute ago. They say that when people confront data, new information, they filter it through, they say a pre-filter. They filter it through a worldview, a belief, an identity, a social group that tends to favor one way of thinking as opposed to another. So the guys in Burns, Oregon, damn it, wrong button. The guys in Burns, Oregon live down here on this chart, and this is in the Kahane article you read. I'm always suspicious of something this simplistic, but it's pretty powerful. If you are the rancher, you are a radical individualist, the cowboy out on the open range, and he has the right to do whatever he wants with his land, and this land belongs to us, not to the big government, not to those people in D.C. who don't know what's happening out here in the West, and you believe that you should be radically individual, that you should not have things imposed upon you. The people like me, for example, would say, no, I believe in collective action and collective lawmaking, not individual action. I believe that there is a kind of hierarchy of rules and laws. I do believe in a kind of egalitarian sense of things, but these folks have a worldview, have a whole position in the world that's radically different from me. I'm trying to think of the example. So Sarah Palin, who just spoke at my former university in Ames, Iowa, talks about death penalty, or death panels and death taxes, which is the large federal government taking your money when somebody dies, or making life and death medical decisions for you, when those should be made by radically by individuals, not by big government. And what I hear instead of death tax, I hear inheritance tax. The data, in fact, says the inheritance tax only affects about 1/2%. People who are inheriting more than $5 million. That's not anybody I know. And I think of it as inheritance tax so that we spread a little bit of the wealth. What they hear with the term death tax is you've got to fight big government because they're intruding. Our governor would say, government's always putting its hand in your pocket to take your money. And what you've got in these arguments often is radically different ideological worldviews, identities, who people are, who they know, how they think. They get tied to individual words. So when I was working in sustainable agriculture in Iowa, we used to talk about sustainability, and that would offend people, but they would talk about stewardship. So we would bring a scientific model and a scientific paradigm of sustainability to it, and they'd shake their heads and they'd talk to us about stewardship, and what they meant was, from a Christian point of view, God gave the world to us and told us to be good stewards of His creation, and they came to the same place that we did. We figured out, and this is part of the second half of the lecture, we figured out how to work with these guys because they believed in the same thing we did. They just talked about it differently. They talked about it as a stewardship. A Christian duty to the land and to family and tradition and heritage. And we talked about nitrogen cycles and, system engineering, and. So Kahane's argument says, functionally, we pre-filter what we hear. Sorry, I better move quickly or I'll never get through this. Individuals tend to pre-filter what they hear through pre-existing beliefs, who you are. And it's not that you can't understand the facts, but if the facts don't support your pre-existing, your predisposition to believe in a particular kind of thing, the facts certainly aren't compelling and motivate you, but they also they don't stick. They wash right off your back. You don't recognize them. It's like being, like me, partly deaf. You just don't hear certain things. A couple of quick ways of explaining this. They borrow three terms to explain their theory of cultural cognition. One of them is cognitive dissonance avoidance. That is, and Eubanks says this, on the one hand, we want to maintain our beliefs. On the other hand, we want to be correct. So we have to select and interpret the evidence in a way that maintains our intellectual coherence. That is, for a lot of these people who are committed to a position, to accept the facts that I give them, they have to either admit that they are wrong or that they are incoherent and contradictory, and you get cognitive dissonance. And being right and staying with your group, your tribe, your homies, your bros, is really important in your social identity. And you want to avoid the dissonance of the, well, I know they're right, but I just can't believe it. So you just don't listen. You avoid the dissonance. It's a psychological defense mechanism. That's part of the rationalist paradox. The second one here is affect. Things that we perceive as harmful or take away our enjoyment, we are going to have a kind of visceral reaction to. So I used to be, still am to some extent, a wilderness winter mountaineer. And my buddy and I put on our mountaineering skis and we cross-country ski up into the mountains in Wyoming and Montana in the middle of the winter and 20 feet of snow and 20 below zero. And we'll ski out for 4 days and we'll camp. And then we sit there and watch the guys on their snowmobiles going high-topping. They run their snowmobile up to the top of a mountain and come down. And all we hear all day long is snowmobile motors, guys with cases of beer strapped on the back of their snowmobiles, and we smell the exhaust, and we've been out in the wilderness for a week skiing. And I look at the snowmobile, it pisses me off. But for them to say you can't run a snowmobile in a national park takes away something that is their identity. It's their form of pleasure. It's what they do. We're in Florida. I'd love to get rid of individual watercraft, the ski-doo kind of things. They're a nuisance, but most of the people who use those are going to have a visceral, affective, emotional response against anything, to limit the thing that gives them pleasure. Am I making some sense? You tell boaters in Florida to slow down in a manatee area. The biggest thing that kills manatees in Florida are propellers. They get hit by boats that are going too fast because the manatees are slow and can't get out of the way. But nobody wants to slow down. They're out water skiing. You mean I can't water ski? And they have an emotional response to that. The third, and I've been talking about this all night, is the cultural foundation of trust. We tend to trust the people that we identify with. We tend to trust, so I'm going to tend to trust professors. And if I were, a very deeply religious person, which is the end of my lecture, I'm going to tend to trust the facts, the ideas, the opinions of the people like me who are members of my congregation and share those things. And let's see how far I've gotten. Come on. Okay. We'll take a break. This is their summary. The same psychological and social processes that induce individuals to form factual beliefs consistent with their cultural orientation, where they were on that quadrant I had, will also prevent them from perceiving contrary empirical data to be credible. Cognitive dissonance, avoidance, will steel individuals to resist empirical data that either threatens practices they revere, riding your snowmobile, riding your watercraft, driving your Hummer, or bolsters the one they despise, particularly when accepting the data would force them to disagree with individuals they respect, their homies, their bros, the people in their community. The cultural judgments embedded in affect, emotional response, will speak more authoritatively than contrary data. as individuals gauge what practices are dangerous and what practices are not. I probably shouldn't have a couple of beers when I get home. But you know, they're going to taste really good, and I'm going to be thirsty, and I'm going to be tired. So I'll do it. And lastly, cultural partisan foundation of trust leads them to dismiss contrary data as unreliable if they perceive that it originates from persons who don't harbor their own cultural commitments. You hear a lot of people who reject sustainability or climate change talking about those elites. They don't want to agree with people they perceive and position as elite, as opposing them, as looking down at them. They've been yelling unos dos eight at them long enough that they just shut them out. These guys didn't invent this. This is a nice way of putting it. Literary theorist and sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, in a book called Distinctions, he's talking about something similar. He's talking about aesthetics, why you like one piece of art, one kind of music, one kind of food, and somebody doesn't. This is, instead of the deficit model, the model of rational enlightenment argument says seeing is believing. When you see, know the facts, you will believe and act. And in fact, Bourdieu, like Cagle says, goes just the opposite. In fact, believing is seeing. You believe first, and then you see. Bourdieu writes it this way. He says, in a sense, one can say that the capacity to see, voir, is a function of knowledge, savoir, or concepts. That is, the words that are available to name visible things, which are, as it were, programs for perception, which is the key term. The eye is a product of history reproduced by education. Bourdieu's point here, and it's Cahayne's, is that seeing is not objective. You see what you have learned to see. Like cultural cognition, the belief, the ideological commitment comes before the facts. That cultural position is like this, is like the concepts. They are pre-filters which allow you to see some things and not see others. Those structural differences are very hard to change. Deeply held worldviews or a lifetime of history tends to determine what you count as a fact and what you don't.
Oh, I just realized it's culture shock. That's what that is. Like, we have a lot of people in the room who are from other countries or have traveled before. This is culture shock, right? When you go someplace new and you can see things that people who have grown up there don't see. And it's because you have been steeped in a culture and your eye has been shaped by your education and your history and your culture.
Another way of putting that, and any of the Chinese speakers in the room will laugh at me, you can hear the distinction between certain words in Chinese if you're a native speaker, because you have learned to hear those distinctions. As a non-native speaker of Chinese, my ear hasn't been trained, and I can't tell the difference between, this is embarrassing, when my wife and I were in Beijing, I tried to say thank you to someone, and I said, she. And one of my Chinese friends said, oh my God, don't say that, you just said something really ugly about his mother. And he explained to me, and I could not hear, because my ear had not been trained to distinguish the patterns, the rhythm, the intonation between thank you and your mother's ugly. And he said, just shut up and let me, they know you're thankful, let me talk. That is, and that's the sense in which linguistically the phonetics you have internalized as a native speaker, not that you can't understand those words, but you literally don't hear the difference between the words that the native speaker. So what I'm trying to get at is a whole series of analogies between linguistics, art, and scientific facts. That is, you don't see facts objectively. You have a pre-filter. Believing and being committed to something comes cognitively, Lord help us, before your ability to say, oh, yes, those are facts, climate change is wrong, therefore I'll do X. Somebody in here, you, said, if I believe it, I'll have to change. One of the reasons lots of people deny climate change is not because they don't see the facts or know the facts, but if they admit that it's true and it's real and humans have caused it, then they have to recognize that the only thing we can do is have not just national, but global regulations on what we can do. And all of a sudden, they have to admit that big government and global government is a good thing, and those radical individualists down in the bottom left corner of that chart have to accept the necessity of federal regulation, the EPA, the UN, and that is, they would rather literally die or have their grandchildren and great-grandchildren have to live with climate change than to admit that big government is right. It's the consequences of accepting the facts that they object to, not the facts. And just giving them the facts doesn't get to the, I think this is sort of where you were going. All right, the last thing I want to say before we break. You read a passage from Meyer's book, and we've talked about this. He says it's not, so I can do this in 30 seconds, it's not that they don't see the facts, or it's not that they don't know the facts, but the facts don't resonate. They're not compelling. They're not attached to everyday material practices that tell us who we are, that tell us what we enjoy, that tell us what our habits are. So Myers says, the way in which environmental problems and environmental in itself are currently understood doesn't generate expressions of concern, but does generate expressions of concern. Oh, gee, that's too bad. But it doesn't resonate deeply enough with many portions of the population. As a result, it can't generate the political context or the psychological context that's a precondition for decisive democratic action and change. I like to rewrite theory in very fancy ways. That is, you can hear the words, but you can't dance to the tune. You understand it, but it doesn't make you shake your booty, it doesn't make you do anything. I think I'm now halfway through, Lord help me, the lecture. That's the problem. Second half is going to be, what do we do about it? How do we think about it? Any questions about anything we've said so far? I kind of got out of order, which was great. Man.
I don't share this, that was great, but.
No, getting out of order was great.
Yeah. So I'm feeling a little bit confused and frustrated because from what I was reading, I did most of this reading. I feel like something we've been saying in here is like us and them and us and them and us and them, and I think it's maybe important to just point out that like we are that stereotype that, like we are us and them. Like to them, we're the hippies that are, whatever, like, yeah, so, and I can admit to myself that when my parents were conservative Fox News watching people speak, I just stopped listening. And I know that about myself. So I feel like it's just like, I hear a lot of like, oh, well, these people and those people out in wherever,
Yeah.
are doing the same thing they're doing.
Agreed.
This is the, going all the way back to one of the very first comments about that nobody has a claim to lack of bias or objectivity. And absolutely, I think I can see myself, my dad is somebody who I often have conversations with where I know for a fact neither one of us is listening to the other one.
Yeah. So we are the elite PhDs when we say like, oh, those people up, and like I just found that frustrating.
That's, I think, my sense of damned if you do, damned if you don't. For people like us who are, getting degrees in sustainability or publishing about climate change and sustainability and rhetoric, and I've, publishing in science journals. I am absolutely committed to the science, the facts, the consequences, the fact that, when I'm not watching myself, people are so bloody stupid, why can't you see? And it just drives me nuts. The rhetorician part of me says, and Myers and Eubanks are exactly right. Thinking that way, there's us and there's them, there's those of us who know and see, and the rest of them, those other people who don't know and don't see. If you think rhetorically, how will what I say and do be perceived and understood by the people to whom I'm talking? As I get older, I get a little less extreme and partisan, a little more willing to listen to other people and think, okay, I'm not going to strategically, I'm not going to get what I want if I just keep yelling unos dos hey and be full of passionate intensity that I'm right. Go ahead.
What I was going to say is that even though you want to think in the best way that you can get the message across to the people, can understand and resonate with them. But also I have to consider whether or not they want to hear. I think this is what you could be talking and somebody's standing there, but they're not gonna listen. It's like when the Jehovah's Witness go to my house, they're talking, but I'm not listening to anything.
Yeah,
So even it doesn't matter how, I guess this class would be how well we communicate sustainably. If people don't want to hear it, and they don't want to listen, they'll be standing there. They don't hear anything.
I think you're probably absolutely right. There are lots of occasions where you're trying to communicate or talk to people. Hey, I teach undergraduates. Half the time, they don't want to be there. They don't want to hear. They're tuned out. I'm talking, and what they're hearing is blah, 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 class over, blah, 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 vacation, blah, 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 assignment. I'm not sure what one does about that. I'd love to wave my little Harry Potter magic wand, but it ain't gonna happen.
Mary, it sounded to me from what you were saying that, I'm glad you said that, because it sounds like we've been talking a lot about efficacy, right? That's what you're here for, to get your degrees, I'm assuming, to actually be effective in the world and make change in the world and create efficacy. But efficacy is not, or I don't think should be our only concern. It sounded to me like your comment was bringing a little bit of an ethical dimension into it, into this question of how do we treat other people like people? How are we generous to other people? And stereotyping isn't a good look if we're trying to be ethical and generous to other people.
And also just recognizing that we were saying like, oh, the confirmation bias, I felt like we were talking like they have a confirmation bias.
Oh, yeah, no.
We also have a confirmation
Yeah, I was about to say,
bias.
if we did not make clear that we think everybody,
That's-
I
that's
tried
what-
to say that earlier.
Yeah, that's what she was saying when she said what always makes me nervous, that, what we think of as facts, in fact, or what we think of as facts and are committed to, are filtered through our own sense of confirmation bias.
Yeah.
We believe in the scientific method, and X, and Y, and Z, and if these guys are right, this applies to us as much as to them. These are
Yeah.
the way personality, identity, social relations, argumentation, cognitive processing work. And they work the principles work for me as well as for the person I disagree with. So it's not like Herndl is the judge and knows everything and is perfectly fair-minded. Those people have confirmation bias and have cultural cognition. So do I, which is what
But
she
we
was
could
trying
use,
to say.
we could use a ton of reminders of that throughout the semester, so like that cannot be
And
repeated
I wasn't
enough.
necessarily saying it towards you, I was saying it more towards the people that are speaking as students here.
No,
Like-
we didn't hear that as at us.
Whatever.
No, I'm happy to own
All of
that.
us.
Paola,
Paola?
did you have, throughout the entire class, I've been like hearing, these arguments, and it just goes back to audience. Just thinking about who are you directing the message to? Who are you talking to? How do you have to change your argument to fit what they understand? And, it also you have to be like very cognitive of what it is that you're saying, so that you can change your argument, and so that you can, filter those things that you would say for yourself differently for that person.
Yeah.
And that's actually a nice transition into the break and pointing us
I
to
have two more-
towards
I have two quick
part
things
two.
I wanna say.
Okay, because that's framing is what you're talking about.
Yes.
We're gonna talk about next.
We are going to go there after. You said, something you said, and who's that, and something, no, you said about people not wanting to listen. There's a line, there's a couplet in W.B. Yeats' poem, The Second Coming, that I think of when I think about this. And Yeats writes, the mid-20th century Irish poet W.B. Yeats, beautiful poem, says, "The worst are full of passionate intensity, and the best lack all conviction." In context, that can be misunderstood, but if you think about rhetoric and audiences, what we've been talking about with how do you move, persuade people, in a sense, the worst communicator is the person who is full of passion and intensity. He keeps yelling, unos, dos, eight, look at the Keeling curve. And he's totally committed to this. And he's the worst communicator. In a sense, the best communicator is not the one who perhaps lacks conviction, but doesn't demonstrate every time he's talking to somebody how committed he is to his position in being right. She is actually willing to listen and hard for somebody like me. Actually deliberate, let other people talk, listen to other people and think, well, yeah, they might have a point there, and they might even disagree with me and not be wrong. Oh, wow, how could that be? And as you're thinking about writing that couplet, the worst are full of passionate intensity, the best lack all conviction. Not always. I think Martin Luther King's passionate intensity was really good in that situation, which leads me to the last thing I'm going to say, and then I really am going to shut up. You said sometimes people don't want to hear. I published an article some years ago about something like that. How do you, the Benford and Snow piece talk about having agency, have the ability to use language, or in their case, frames, to change minds and get things done, the ability to take action and have it work. How do you have agency? And the short version of this goes, I think that is a kind of moment in social space and time, and it's quixotic, it opens and it closes. Sometimes there's an opportunity. You're in the right place at the right time with the right words, and you get lucky. If you're not in the right place at the right time, it doesn't matter if you have the right words. You can talk till you're blue in the face. If the situation, the context, the rhetorical, social space, people don't want to hear. You have to have people who are willing to hear. You have to have, I was reading a book about policy, and it says to have policy change, you have to have crisis, you have to have constituency, and you have to have a theory to explain it. Well, often if you don't have a crisis or a constituency, if you don't have people who want to hear and some exigency, some reason for them to care, beautiful words, great rhetoric, doesn't matter if you're in a situation where people don't want to hear. People don't want to hear about climate change, but all of a sudden we have, this year was the hottest year in history by 0.29 degrees, maybe, and then we're going to have this terrible, hot summer. Maybe you have a condition where people will hear. So I'm trying to take your point and suggest you're absolutely right. You have to pick your time, place, context, situation. Otherwise, you're just talking into space. And on that depressing note, we're going to take a break.
10 minutes, so we'll start back at 7:40.
Mary never agreed with her. She thinks that entire life we've been I'm going to build solar panel.
I feel like
That's sensible.
what's going on here?
We don't have that part of surgery.
What's the meaning of
I do like things like 2 minutes for the wire.
advocacy? Advocacy.
And then you can sort out the registration. Are you gonna have to get a or something? Carl's gonna have to call that Sunday, and she talks about it. Please give me talk here tomorrow.
The metaphor goes back to the law. If you are charged with a crime, the lawyer is your advocate. He argues your case in a partisan way for you in court. Somebody who speaks on your behalf. That word becomes a metaphor so that advocate is someone who has a position, has an agenda, and argues for that position and agenda. So a scientist is going to want to say, I do objective, neutral science. I just present facts. Somebody who is an environmental advocate is somebody who takes that research and says, I'm not generating knowledge. I'm not a scientist. I'm not claiming to be objective. I'm making a really hard argument that you know, you ought to do X, I'm advocating for a position or scientists will typically say,
And I throw back at him and say, I don't need it.
Confusion like yesterday. I was like, my father was like, why is it there?
Yeah.
And then I checked, I was like, no, I took a picture. The picture, there was one digit that was not in the picture. And my father was like,
there's a sense in which the scientists I work with say, look, I'm going to follow the facts wherever they lead me, whether I like it or not, because I'm going to follow those facts. I don't have a stake in this, an axe to grind. I'm not trying to convince you of anything, what you should do, think or believe. I'm just saying, here's what he says. An advocate has a position, knows what he wants, and argues not for facts, but this is what we should do, this is what's valuable. At USF, a guy named Rob Benford from sociology is one of the, well, you read the article, Benford and Snow on framing and frame theory. Rob is one of the granddaddies of American frame theory. It's a theory that emerged from a book called Framing by the sociologist Irving Goffman in the middle of the 20th century. And framing is a resource and a problem. Like most things, I can't believe I'm going to talk about da-da-da. Anything in rhetoric is what the French deconstructive philosopher Derrida called a pharmacon. Not in your notes, not in the lecture, I'm freelancing. And Derrida says that knowledge or language or rhetoric is what in Greek was called a pharmacon, a medicine. We were just talking about medicines. Medicines can be helpful or they can be harmful. You can use a medicine to cure something, and if you take the wrong medicine or too much of it, it will kill you. Medicines can be used. They are, in a sense, neutral tools. Language, rhetoric, argument is a neutral tool. I can use language and rhetoric to persuade you to smoke cigarettes and that climate change doesn't exist, or I can use it for the other kinds of arguments. What I would call, I can argue on the dark side, or I can argue with the Force. Me and Luke Skywalker. Framing is in many ways like that. Famously, a few years ago, the linguist George Lakoff published a book called How to Talk to an Elephant. Know Your Values and Frame the Debate, the Essential Guide for Progressives. Anybody know this book or know what the joke in the title is? How to Talk to an Elephant? If you're a Democrat and a progressive, how do you talk to the Republican Party, right? Democrats are donkeys, the image of the party. The Republican, the GOP is the elephant. How do you talk to the other side? How do you talk to other people? When Sarah Palin talks about the inheritance tax as a death tax, she is taking something, a tax, giving it a metaphor, death tax, and she's framing it in a set of values and an argument that says government is a bad thing. Individual rights and freedoms should not be impinged upon by the government. Limited government is good. Taxes are therefore bad. The IRS is bad. And she frames that one thing in a large argument about rights and individuality. And it's almost impossible, as I guess Eubanks says, once a frame gets built and in place, it's very hard to resist or overturn or change, but they can be. So I want to talk about framing. According to my friend Rob Benford, and this is in the lecture, this is Rob and I were talking one day, so I said, Rob, define framing, and collective action frames for me. So frames, he said, each of us employs schemas, patterns, strategies of interpretation which enable us to locate, perceive, identify, label things that happen in our life. These interpretive frames help us render events or occurrences meaningful and thereby function to organize our experience and guide our actions. So when I look at what's happening in Burns, Oregon, I frame it in a particular way because I believe in preserving wilderness. I'm an environmentalist. I believe in collective values. I've read Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons. and I think about the necessity to have regulations so that individuals don't screw up the land that belongs to all of us because it's collectively held and it's a common. So I look at Burns, Oregon, and I frame it as, you know, within a tradition that goes back to things like Silent Spring and Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac. And it comes to me as part of a coherent interpretive strategy. It comes to the folks in Burns as part of a different interpretive strategy, a schema, an interpretive strategy for the world. Framing, what you do, that's what they are, what you do. Framing isn't just jingoism or sloganeering. It entails a dynamic, interactive, contentious politics of giving things meaning, signification. To borrow a term from Stuart Hall, framing processes affect how we make sense of events, define situations, in essence, how we are socially constructing reality. So my example, if I frame sustainable agriculture as science and agronomy, it interprets reality one way. If I frame it within stewardship, if I frame it within a Christian ethic of caring for God's creation, and I use that, I invoke that frame through stewardship, it means something completely different. One is an abstract scientific concept, one is a felt moral duty. One will work with one group of people, one framing will work with another audience. Everything is framed. What you get at the end, collective action frames, according to Rob Benford, they perform those functions, they simplify, they condense aspects of the world out there in ways that help us mobilize activity, garner the things we want to do, garner bystander support, demobilize our opponents. Collective action frames are action-oriented sets of beliefs and meanings that inspire and legitimate activities and campaigns and social movements. When we get to the last part of the course and we're talking about social movements, we're talking about building coalitions, we're talking about the microplastic awareness, we are talking about building collective action frames to garner bystander support, mobilize people, build coalitions. Frames can help you do that. They are a resource. So here's Benford and Snow. I've highlighted the sentence that I will unpack. Rob is a social movement scholar. He studies the civil rights movement and was part of the anti-nuclear movement in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. His scholarship is on social movements and social change. Ideal for people in sustainability. Sustainability is a social movement for social change, like the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, the feminist movement. So he says that social movement scholars characterize the work, the signifying or meaning construction work of framing. This denotes, he says, and I'll unpack this, active processual phenomena. It's a process. It implies agency. It implies contention at the level of reality construction. Let's see. It's active in the sense that something's being done. It's a process. It's dynamic. It's ongoing. It's never finished. It's always at risk. It's agentive in the sense that people have the ability to change minds. If we didn't believe we had the ability to change minds, nobody would be in sustainability, nobody would be a rhetorician. Framing suggests you can frame things and you can reframe things. You can change framing. You can change the way people think about it. And he says it's contentious. It happens in the public sphere where people argue about frames. It's what's going on again in Burns, Oregon. So it's an activity, it's contested. In a sense, those four positions on the grid that we looked at earlier from Kahane and Brahman, the white grid, those four positions are always trying to frame what's happening in the country. It's what political elections are about. The best framing person in the country is the guy, Frank Lutz, thank you, who works for the GOP. He's the guy who has successfully framed climate change as global warming.
Other way around.
Okay, other way around. Global warming is climate change, sorry.
And he made it less scary.
But Frank Lutz is a frame theorist. He's the guy, He is the political propaganda expert of the Republican Party, which is what Irving Goffman was saying, not Irving Goffman, but George Lakoff was saying when he said, look, Democrats, you've got all these great ideas, but you don't know how to talk to people. Lutz is eating your lunch. The Republicans are winning the day. They're wrong. He's a partisan. He's an advocate for a particular position. Ah, there you are. But he's really good at framing things in ways that are meaningful, that resonate with people's everyday experience, that resonate with their cultural identity, their cultural cognition, and that motivate them to act. That's what framing is about, and it's a contest.
Well,
Yes?
in going back to what we were talking before, and you used a word that it gave a lot of light in what we were talking, which is propaganda. When you look at some of the propaganda that the Nazi had, if you look at from the propaganda perspective, it was very beautiful, and there was these values that they were associated to these practices that were horrific, but to the majority of the people, they would associate to those values and certain things, and then they ended up doing the wrong thing out of noble principles and ideas.
The biggest argument against my profession, being a rhetorician, was launched by Plato. And Plato basically said that rhetoricians, the sophists, were a bunch of corrupt liars who were just guns for hire, like lawyers. They'd defend anything if you paid them well enough.
And
It's
obscure
dangerous.
the truth.
Huh?
We obscure the truth too, don't forget
Yeah,
that.
we don't have any truth, we don't believe in truth, we obscure the truth. I'm wary to say so in public, especially on film, but you are right. The propaganda organization for the Nazis was incredibly sophisticated and successful. Doesn't mean I'm not saying that was horrible and all that. It's what I meant when I said rhetoric or language is a pharmacon. It can be used for good or for ill. It's a set of strategies, skills, tools. I can use a hammer to build a house for the homeless. I can use it to beat somebody to death. Doesn't mean the hammer's not a good tool. The Nazis used rhetoric, and I will make a distinction between good and bad rhetoric and explain what propaganda is in just a second. Sir?
Yeah, I don't want to sidestep right because I actually studied a lot of Nazi history, and they had a fantastic but horrible propaganda machine that, I mean, they concentrated at a time where the Weimar Republic that was created and people taking wheelbarrows full of money to buy a loaf of bread was a very easy thing, and then you had, unfortunately, the Jewish people who ran jewelry
Well, where you're going is back to framing, right? That
Yeah.
their propaganda hit upon an economic frame,
It did, and they,
which was specific to, Carl was talking earlier about this question of people don't want to listen.
yeah.
That you got to catch them at the right time in the right place with the right message.
Yeah.
And so the example you're giving of Weimar Republic and runaway inflation and the
Yeah.
that classic image of the wheelbarrows of money is taking us back to the economic frame.
Well, kind of, and that I want to kind of tool into, it kind of runs into the 1/3 of the people in our country right now that don't believe in it. I think that there are a decent portion of those that is not necessarily that they don't believe in it, it's just that it's not a priority for them. If you're struggling, you don't have a job, you're in the Rust Belt, and there's really no good outlook. Does it really matter to you whether the earth gets hotter or not?
Just to clarify, that 1/3 number actually comes from a survey that literally asked the question, do you believe in climate change or not? So, but then we have to start parsing, why are people answering the way they do, and then if the majority of Americans do believe in climate change, why are we not doing more about it? Which gets us back to this question of I believe, but I don't want to do anything. Right, so it gets super complicated.
And then even surveys are kind of, I mean, really, there's no such thing as a perfect survey, and it's all dependent on where you're giving it in.
Yeah, let me address part of your comment, which is, and you're right, which is there are a lot of people who are suffering and struggling to feed themselves or X, Y, and Z, and they don't have the time or energy to worry about environmental issues, sustainability, or climate change. You're going to run into that. One of the arguments that Eubanks makes in his book on engaging the everyday, Myers makes in the book on engaging the everyday, he says, part of our problem is we tend to accept the framing that sets sustainability, climate change, environmental action in opposition to or against everyday agency and needs and everyday practices. we have accepted the traditional conservative framing that these issues are separate, extra, added on top of the important everyday things of making a living and surviving in economics. And one of the things Myers says is what we have to learn is engage everyday material practices and make sustainability and environmental things meaningful, so it's not a choice between the immediate material physical necessities of life and this extra thing called sustainability or environmentalism. And framing can help you think about, don't frame it as this against this, make it resonate by tying it to everyday material practices. How much money do I spend on my automobile every year? How much time do I spend on bloody I-275 every year? Those material, everyday routine practices that we can not make sustainability or environmentalism something separate, different, oppositional, and against, but part of. Did you have something you want to say here?
And something like we're seeing now, trying to change that frame. It's not against like economic growth and jobs. And we just saw the president, Obama just said, let's lead the new technology. Let's try to take those, advantages and stuff like that. So it looks like to me they're trying to change that frame.
What they are trying to do is reframe. They're trying to reposition issues of sustainability in frames that aren't oppositional. I want to go back partly because I love the title. You were talking about the Nazis and propaganda. I will say that rhetoric, language, argument is a pharmacon, can be used for good or ill, like a hammer. On the other hand, Bill Covino published a book on rhetoric and magic, and he was talking about the good and bad magic of the National Enquirer. It's a scholar writing about the National Enquirer. You all know the rag at the grocery store, the National Enquirer. And
Stories about Bat Boy.
yeah,
Aliens.
seven
is awesome.
yeah, 7 steps to a tighter tummy, 6 steps to better sex. Everything can be broken down to a magical formula that will change your life if you know that the 7 steps to success. And he makes a distinction between what he calls good and bad rhetoric, good and bad magic. Good rhetoric opens up questions, opens up possibilities, opens up and engages people to ask, explore, learn more. Bad rhetoric, propaganda, closes down discovery, closes down questioning, closes down the process of discovery. It says, here's a ready-made magic bullet will solve your problem, as opposed to, here's a way of engaging, deliberating, learning more, asking more questions. Rhetoric used to open as opposed to used to close. Yes, and then I got to move on.
No, I know. I think as sustainability professionals, where we come up short is that a lot of us spend most of our time trying to argue, whereas if you actually look at the way the system really works, one of those ones where unfortunately we're never going to throw out our political system and come up with something that's fair. But if you incentivize the people in those states, the Rust Belt states, who are very good, very well placed for renewables, Oklahoma, Kansas, places that are really windy, if you had companies that just bit the bullet and went in and trained those people and gave them jobs, you wouldn't need to really win them over sustainability. They wouldn't care, but they would support it because of the sheer fact that that is where their job was. And you would go ahead and you would backdoor it, and then the politicians would support it because of the fact that if you're a solar company and you're in a sunny Rust Belt state, and you say, hey, I'm going to build this new solar plant in your state, if you go ahead and support this bill, that's instant votes for them because they just created jobs.
It's the material argument, right? That if you can materially get your way to the end that you're going for, do you really need to persuade people to agree with you or not? And that's an open question, for sure. But
Yeah.
Carl, you gotta
Yeah, I got to
get
move.
back.
Okay, so if you look at framing, I want to look, this is a diagram I pulled from, of all places, the British Journal British Journal of Industrial Relations. And it takes what you read in Benford and Snow and lays it out for you. The activity we're talking about, the framing, happens here in the middle. They talk about a series of master frames. And Benford, I'll come back to this. Benford and Snow will say there are, at least in America, a series of master frames, master narratives. Injustice, rights, choice, return to democracy, environmental justice, cultural pluralism. They give you, I think in that article, the example of in Canada, a conservative religious group wanted to have state funding for religious schools, and they managed to frame it as Canada is a culturally plural organization, and we need to admit the cultural plurality of, of the place of the religious community, and people need to have choices in this country. You talk about charter schools and vouchers. That's framed against, in some senses, the best interests of public education as choice, school choice. It's that argument that the teachers union and most public schools disagree with is successful because it's framed as, in the American master narrative of choice. So these master narratives, the guys in Burns, Oregon, are making this argument, individual rights, and they're making this argument. It's an injustice that the big federal government, the jackbooted federal thugs, as they like to call them, are coming down and forcing us off our land. And they are successful because these are narratives, stories, frames, values that are core to the American culture and American identity. And anything that is framed in this way, including things in sustainability, will be more successful. Back to my diagram. A lot of the, I want to look here, since we read the resonance dilemma, a lot of what goes on here in, oh dear, I hit the wrong button again. You need to have frames that resonate. This is Meyer's book about the resonance dilemma. How do we get things that resonate with people? If a frame resonates with the audience, you will get individual participation, which is what we want, and you will get collective action. You use the kind of master frames, you go through the framing process, and if your frames align or resonate with people, that tends to lead to persuade them and to motivate them to act. So how do things resonate? Meyer says it resonates if it's attached to everyday, valued, routine, material practices. Benford and Snow say things resonate because they are credible. Keep hitting the wrong button. Because they are credible. That is, the frame is consistent. You have some evidence, empirical evidence and data that's credible. The people who articulate that frame are credible, believable spokespersons. The best example I can give you for this, probably nobody in here remembers the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, in the Reagan administration. They proposed to set a global network of satellites above the planet with radar-guided lasers, so that when the Soviets sent their ICBM missiles over, our satellite net would see them, shoot them out of space before they came into the atmosphere with their radar. I actually know the guy who did the 5-year-long Pentagon study that said it wouldn't work. It was technologically unfeasible. But I need a marker. Thank you. Framing, resonance. President Reagan got up on TV and he drew a picture of a house, and he's almost as bad an artist, was almost as bad an artist as me, and a family, little stick figures. And then we got the little stick figures, the kitties. I don't know I can't remember whether he had a doggy or not. And he said, the Star Wars Defense Initiative will be a peace shield over America. And the missiles that come in won't be able to get in. And the Strategic Defense Initiative will will be a peace shield over your family. And that's an incredibly powerful emotional frame about families. That was the presidency that sold itself as family values. And he then had Robert J. Oppenheimer, the director of the Manhattan Project that invented the atomic bomb that ended World War II. He had Bob Oppenheimer on stage. He was America's nuclear scientist who ended World War II. And he said, and Robert J. Oppenheimer is right here. That is the issue of a credible articulator. And Oppenheimer said, yes, this will work. It's a great piece of science. It's a great piece of physics. And we spent $3 or $4 trillion on it, and then we abandoned it because it didn't work. But the framing resonated because they had somebody everybody admired and trusted, Bob Oppenheimer, and he framed it as families, family values, freedom, as us against them, quite literally xenophobia, island America with its shield against bad things. And it worked. It was a terrible technical program, but the framing was masterful. Sometimes Reagan really was the great communicator.
But you gotta take into consideration the time, right? You're in like Cold War stuff. So.
Sure, sure. And that's sort of what I meant when I was asking his question about exigency, about the moment, about the social, social moment in time and space. It was the right time to make that argument.
Yeah. That picture would mean something very different post-housing crash of 2008, right? Like, who in here owns a house? Definitely not me. That is not convincing to me. Like, I don't have a house to protect.
Plus there was also during that time the idea that that technology will solve all the issues,
Yes.
all the problems.
Yes.
I mean, and then you something will come like that. You're like, oh, there's a technological solution to this problem, so let's embrace it.
Yeah. Well, that's why they had Oppenheimer. The technological breakthrough, the Manhattan Project, solved, if you will, the problem of that war. So let me move on. The second issue here that's more important to me is salience. That is, it resonates or is aligned, a frame resonates or aligned when it is attached to people's values, but to important values, not peripheral ones, central values like the family. When it is commensurate, it rings with our everyday experience. It makes sense of the way we lead our everyday lives. We think about it, and as I'm driving to school or shopping in the grocery store, oh, okay, that frame makes sense of what's going on here, not in some abstract way, but in a material everyday activity. And it's often good if it's attached to a narrative we tell about America being a special place, about being the city on the hill, being the unique place, being the exception in the world. Because in fact, this protects us, but nobody else, and we are the exceptions who get protected in that framing. So frames work if they are consistent and credible, but really I think frames work, having read Myers, if they are salient, they echo, they resonate with everyday experience. Let's see. Since we're moving fast, or we're running out of time, I'm gonna move fast. Some years ago, one of my colleagues and I published an article, and in some ways this is what this whole lecture is about. We were writing about the John Birch Society. Anybody know what the John Birch Society is? It's an early environmental version of the Tea Party. They were a group in the 70s and 80s, ultra right-wing, anti-environmentalist, kind of rancher, oil company, extractive industry people. And Rob and I were writing the first Earth Day. The John Birch Society came out arguing against Earth Day, that the planet was fragile, that we had to worry about the environment. And Robin and I wrote and published an article and said, look, the debate with the John Birch Society, oddly enough, anticipating Kahane by 20 years, is not really an argument about facts. It's only secondarily about facts. It's really an argument about their cultural identity, that they feel marginalized in America, that they feel that those elites don't listen to them, that they feel that their way of life is being disrespected, that their values are being disrespected and being rejected. And the argument was really an argument about powerlessness and marginalization in American culture. I didn't know Unos Dos 8 then, but our argument in 1996 was, it's not going to do any good to yell a bunch of facts at the John Birch Society. Another way of putting that is, not only do frames link individuals and groups ideologically in ideas, but they also they buttress, they embellish identities. They tell you who you are. They give you your position in social conflict. You know who's the us, who's the them, who your community is, and framing can help you. It can put you literally in your place. Who am I? Where do I belong? What do I believe? Who's my family? But framing can also begin, hopefully, and this is the next issue here, to change those lines so that the sustainability experts at Iowa State and the people from the religious community built frames. Oops, back up one. I'm going to back up a couple more. Right here, in the center of this screen, Rob, Benford, and Snow talk about what they call bridging. You can build frames that bridge different groups. That instead of, and I'm just going to, I keep using the example, sustainability example and a religious example. You can build a frame of sustainability around stewardship that bridges, brings together, that connects two different kinds of frames that seem to be in opposition, religion and science, and bridge them, put them together, that resonate with everyday life, and those are the things that will motivate those farmers. I used to belong to a farmer-organized organic community called the Practical Farmers of Iowa, and we met and had dinner and lectures 3 or 4 times a year, a bunch of farmers and a bunch of scientists, and figured out how to build frames around sustainability and stewardship and family that, in fact, led to bringing farmers into sustainability and a group that performed collective action. That is, we built the kind of coalition and that kind of change around sustainability that we're talking about in the latter part of this course. And we did it through framing, but framing specifically to bridge the way the values, the stories, the frames that those people use with the values, stories, and frames that we use. And a lot of that's done with individual words. I'm almost done, I think. Come on.
There we go, Slaughterdyke.
Slaughterdyke. Okay. Did it go away? Okay. I'll do this quickly. Cynical reasoning. Knowing the right or correct answer, but nonetheless acting as if you didn't. 2 philosophers, Peter Slaughterdyke, a German, and say this on Saturday night, Slavoj Žižek.
Yeah.
Both come out of continental philosophical traditions. The short version of what they're saying, I think, did I put marks in here? No.
Yeah, it's the next one.
The short version of what these guys are saying is a lot of the times we behave as if we didn't know because doing is more powerful than knowing. Acting is more powerful than thinking. My example. Do I have Blaise Pascal in here? Yes,
there he is.
I'll back up. Blaise Pascal, the French mathematician who invented statistics, says, make no mistake, we are as much automatons as mind, machine as mind, body as mind. Proofs only convince the mind. Habit, material activity, provides the strongest proofs, those that are most believed. It resonates. It inclines the automaton, which leads the mind unconsciously with it. He's famous for saying, if you don't believe in God, but you'd like to believe in God and religion, he said every day, twice a day, get down on your knees, Catholic and French, make the sign of the cross and pray, and eventually you will come to believe. That action precedes belief. That action precedes ideas. In the same way that Cagle and Bourdieu say that beliefs precede facts. So if I back up one to Karl Marx, in the German ideology whatever else is true or not of Marx, Marx said something that's fundamentally true. He says the production of ideas, conceptions, consciousness is at first directly interwoven with material activity and material intercourse of men, no women did anything, and the language of real life. Consciousness can never be anything other than conscious existence and the existence of men in their actual life processes. Life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life. The take-home lesson is in the last sentence. Ideas don't fall into your head ready-made from above, like Athena jumping ready-made from the head of Zeus. Ideas, concepts, and values emerge from your material life activity. What Marx says is, what you do for a living, where you live in a society, what you do, tends to determine a lot about consciousness, your ideas, your beliefs. So, those ranchers who are, the rugged individual out in the West, what they do tends to determine the beliefs. Why is it that somebody who makes $10 million a year believes in a flat tax, and somebody who makes what the people in this room makes believe in a progressive tax? What you do, how you make a living, your everyday experience tends largely to determine what your ideas are. If you're making $5 million a year, you'd really love it if everybody paid a 10% tax, because that would lower yours from whatever it is to 10%. But if you're here, you'd like to say that if you're in the middle class, you'd like to say, well, the guys who are making $10 million a year really ought to pay a little more than I do. Whether that's right or wrong, I won't agree with you. But Marx's point, and the point I'm getting to, is that ideas don't come first. Ideas about sustainability, about climate change, tend to emerge from practical lived experience, what you do for a living. It's hard to believe in climate change if you're a coal miner. Your example in the back. Thank you. So I think I've got,
I don't know what it's doing. It's very odd.
so my take-home lesson, the doing of everyday practices inculcates values and ideas and motives. Do I have a picture of my, yes. So here, later in the semester we'll talk about games and gaming, and serious gaming. Game theorists, she reads a lot of game theory, and we'll talk to you about game theory. Game theorists have gotten around to say you can change the way people think by having them play games. That what they do can change their ideas. They're using this Marxist materialist activity. And games are fun. You play a game, I shouldn't admit this in public. My wife, the brilliant theorist, published 5 books, runs a department, gets home from work and she's really tired, she'll sit and play Candy Crush for half an hour. It's the stupidest game on the planet.
Wait,
but
just half an hour? Because that's like not humanly possible.
and then she goes and plays Bach on the piano. But Joshua.
When you say game theory, do you mean like the economics understanding of game theory?
No, two different.
We mean video games. We mean playing games.
There's game theory, the mathematical economics, yes, absolutely, and then there's gaming theory.
That's highbrow. We're talking lowbrow. We're talking
He said
gaming.
game theory, but
We're
it's
talking
gaming.
Candy Crush.
Gaming theory. So we'll watch some videos about that kind of thing. And
my short version of this is this right here. It doesn't look like mine, but when I get in my car today to go home, the readout on my car tells me what my miles per gallon are, and I can push buttons and it'll tell me, here's your average, you're above average, below average. And when I drive home, I know I'll do this, when I drive home from here, I will time the stoplights, I will pick the route, I will occasionally run a late yellow light, I'll play with my accelerator so I don't burn too much gas, but it's worth burning some gas if I can hit the timing on the light so I don't sit at the light and have to accelerate and move the momentum. And I watch the readout on my dashboard, and I play a game with my car. And the game for me is, can I go home when I make the 15-mile drive from here to my house in South Tampa? What's the highest miles per gallon on that trip I can get? And I play a game with myself every time I do it. As a result, every time I'm in my car, whether I'm doing this or not, I'm constantly thinking about miles per gallon, acceleration, maximizing the efficiency of my driving habits. And I'm somebody who most of my life liked to drive really fast cars at suicidally fast speeds. When my wife got out of cancer treatment, we went out and bought a very fast convertible sports car. And we lived in New Mexico, and We'd go out in the desert, drop the top, cruise along at about 120 with really loud rock and roll playing. And it was really fun out in the desert. I mean, desert's flat, straight, no driveways for 30 miles, no cars, no nothing. Drive as fast as you want, Bonneville salt flats.
But now you would feel bad about doing that.
Now I would feel bad about doing that. So gaming, in a sense, gaming is the extreme version of the Marxist materialist argument that doing things can change what you believe. Do I have it? Okay, last thing I will say, that's not me, that's the machine.
No, it's the machine. It can smell our fear.
And I do this partially just because I love this. Has anybody here ever heard of the movement called Creation Care? Dick Cizik used to be the executive director of the American Council of Evangelical Christians, and we're all thinking anti-science, anti-climate change. I've heard him speak a number of times, met him a couple of times. He and a group of evangelical Christians came out with the evangelical call to action, their argument for action on climate change. And this was, I don't know, 6, 7 years ago. How do you frame climate change in something other than science in ways that are successful? This is Dick Cizik. Over the last several years, many of us have engaged in study, reflection, and prayer related to the issue of climate change, often called global warming. For most of us, until recently, this has not been treated as a pressing issue or major priority. Indeed, many of us have required considerable convincing before coming to be persuaded that climate change is a real problem, that it ought to matter to us as Christians. But now we have seen and heard enough to offer the following moral argument related to the matter of human-induced climate change. We commend the 4 simple but urgent claims offered in this document to all who will listen, beginning with our brothers and sisters in the Christian community, and urge all to take the appropriate actions that follow from them. And then it goes on, the 4 basic principles of climate change, that it's real, that it's caused by humans, that it's morally wrong, and that we need to do something about it. These guys are framing climate change. Now, it's not going to work for everybody, but it works for a very large swath of them, you were saying us and them, of people that we would typically think of as them. They don't believe in evolution, they don't believe in climate change, blah, blah, blah. And this is a bridging frame. They are bridging seemingly opposed framings, interpretive schemas for the world, and using the language that works. And so my last slide, and I'm going to be done, is if I've been successful tonight, I've convinced you that the deficit model doesn't work, that just yelling the facts won't work. I'm not saying it doesn't have its place. We are going to learn about how to accommodate facts for non-expert audiences and for decision-making audiences. I'm not saying facts aren't important. I'm not saying learning how to talk about those facts clearly and accessibly is not important, but they're not sufficient. You need them, but they don't do the job by themselves. You need other tools. You need to listen to other people. Kahane is right. Bourdieu is right. People often don't hear or see those facts, and even when they do, they don't resonate. They don't move you to act. How do you go about doing that? I've given you a couple of strategies. One, framing, frame theory. The other is the notion of games or action and doing. So into the lecture, don't be the ugly American. Don't just yell unos dos eight. It ain't gonna work. Questions? I'm done. Boy, am I done. I'm done on this side. Turn me over. It's 8:30. I've been talking for 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
We have 15 minutes. Questions? Yeah, you can do that. There you go. You the man. You the man. You the man. You the man.
I'm not adding anymore.
We have
Anybody?
designated laughters and a designated clapper now.
Yes, we have a designated clapper, a designated laugher. Somebody's going to have to be the designated frowner, head shaker.
Yeah.
Are we done? That's a long lecture. It's probably the longest lecture you're going to get. If you're me, this is the problem. I'm working on the controversy in the Keys over Aedes aegypti mosquitoes. How do you get the people in Key West to deliberate and come to a peaceable collective consensus about the threat of dengue and chikungunya and the threat of a genetically modified mosquito released in their homes and their environment? Why are these people fighting with each other? How do we understand this? What do we do about it? Not, why are they wrong? But how do we engage in a productive conversation? Sir?
Just a quick curiosity.
What's my position on dengue?
The mosquito.
On the mosquito?
Because we did, dengue is a big problem in Brazil, and we did an experiment, and 82% dropped on dengue issues on one city.
I have two positions, one on dengue and the mosquito, one on the controversy. The issue of dengue and the mosquito, if you know about invasive, does everybody know what we're talking about? Dengue fever, bone break fever, has no cure, can sometimes be fatal. It is increasingly endemic in South America, Central America. If you're in this country, with climate change, the geographic spread of disease vectors are changing, and dengue is coming, as is chikungunya, as is malaria, into the continental United States.
There's another virus.
The Zeta virus,
Yeah,
yes.
that one just.
So the issue here is, I'm sorry, Amy, did you?
I just had a quick question. Is this the one that changes the shape and size of the head?
Can you say that louder?
Is this one that changes the size of the head?
Newborns.
With the new?
Yeah,
The new one,
that's the-
Zeta
trying to
causes
connect
micro,
that's that
Zeta
last
causes
one.
microcephaly,
Okay.
small head size
Yeah.
of babies in pregnant, when women who are pregnant. So and all three of those diseases are carried by the Aedes aegypti mosquito, which is a very particular kind of mosquito. It tends to live around people. It likes to live in clean water, not dirty water. It tends to be in houses. It's very hard to eradicate. So the science of this says if you have an invasive pest species, you can try to kill it with physical or chemical means, sprays or traps. And you get the usual evolutionary change that the sprays, the insecticides work, and then the pest adapts, and your insecticides become increasingly less efficacious, and you have to use more and stronger insecticides. A bad route. The genetic modification that they have with the Aedes, let me see if I can put this succinctly. They have modified the male mosquito. Male mosquitoes don't bite humans, don't bite and drink blood, only females do. They have modified the male mosquito with a particular genetic splice that does two things. It gets passed on to its offspring, and if you have this splice, if the mosquito has this splice, it can only live in an environment of the antibiotic tetracycline, which doesn't exist in nature except in trace elements. So what that means is the purpose of this, like diploid carp for fish infestations, the Aedes interrupts the population dynamics of the mosquito. It interrupts the reproductive cycle of the mosquito. The sterile males, or the males, the mutant males, the genetically modified male mosquitoes, mate with the wild females and compete for that with wild males. But all of their offspring pick up the gene. And because they're out in nature with no tetracycline, the male mosquito dies and all the offspring die. And what you will see is when you flood a population with genetically modified Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, you will see before long a very steep drop in the population because the reproductive cycle has been disrupted by the sterile GMO mosquito. The problem with that is when you stop introducing GMO mosquito, the population is going to rebound. So you have to do it all the time. It is a self-limiting genetic. They die off, so they don't persist. That's the difference between that and genetically modified foods, where the plants keep growing. So in some senses, it's safer. In some senses, it's environmentally better than lots of poison. It's more effective than lots of traps. But you have to keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it, or the population just rebounds. The other problem, and this is what most people who are objecting to it, so my first answer is I think it is a technologically extraordinarily sophisticated solution to a terrible public health problem. Most people will object to it on a variety of grounds, one of which is, how do you know what's going to happen? They call it the Frankenbug. You've genetically modified an organism, released it into our environment. You don't know, and you can't convince me that you know what's going to happen with this bug, whether or not it's going to mutate, whether or not genetic modification can move from one species to another species, what's going to happen in an ecosystem when you pull one element out of the ecosystem, what fills that niche, what's going to happen. People also argue the controversy is you're screwing with nature. Most of our problems are already there because we started screwing with nature. We're getting dengue because we screwed with nature with climate change and CO2. So your solution is to screw with nature some more, and this is going to cause other problems. Just stop screwing with Mother Nature is the argument against it. So do I think it's a technologically sophisticated solution? Yes. That's the fact and the science. Do I think that the political discussion over what's the risk and what's our values and do we as a community want to do this? People have a right to object. People have a right to deliberate. And in the cases where this has gone badly, it's because my friends in public health and my friends who are the scientists, my friends who are the geneticists say, why don't you just listen to us? Look, we've explained it to you. We showed you the slides. There is no danger. Trust me on this. This is the right solution. Why are you so bloody pig-headed? And I've watched all the videos of town halls in Key West where this happens, and you can see the audience just get angrier and angrier and distant. The deficit model didn't work. So as a controversy, it's a problem. As a technical solution, it's a very elegant technical solution. And they are now starting to try to use this for malaria as well. Now, can you genetically modify enough mosquitoes and release them long enough all over the tropics to keep malaria, dengue, chikungunya, and Zika down? It's better than nothing, but it's not a cure. So, it's a very complicated, it's a very complicated issue. As a controversy for a rhetorician, it's really interesting to watch these people argue and figure out why they're arguing, why the facts aren't persuading people. I mean, in a sense, I'll just rewrite this lecture when I publish that article.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're done.
Yep. We'll see you all next week.
Thanks for talking to us.
Yes.
We'll see you next week.
More readings, not quite as many.
Yeah, not quite as many, and the lecture next week is not as long. It's only about an hour long.
And we'll do another style exercise.
Yeah, we'll do another style exercise. It'll be more fun.